verse, and you're missing at the 34th verse. And there it reads, and a certain woman, which had an issue of blood 12 years, and had suffered many things of many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was nothing better, but rather grew worse. When she heard Jesus came in the press behind and touched his garment. For she said, if I may touch but his clothes, I shall be whole. And straightway the fountain of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of that plague. And Jesus, immediately knowing in himself that virtue had gone out of him, turned him about in the press, and said, who touched my clothes? And his disciples said unto him, thou seest the multitude thronging thee, and sayest thou, who touched me? And he looked round about to see her that had done this thing. But the woman, fearing and trembling, knowing what was done in her, came and fell down before him and told him all the truth. And he said unto her, daughter, thy faith hath made thee whole. Go in peace and be whole of thy plague. And I want you to turn to your neighbor and say, neighbor, I've got to get to Jesus.
I've got to get to Jesus.
By any means necessary.
By any means necessary.
We thought to share it with you on this morning, being that it is a youth day morning. Every second Sunday of the month is youth day morning. And there are a lot of things that we are confronted with. We as youth today, we're confronted with many different things throughout the week and the month and the years. There are different things that we encounter in our lives that will cause us to give up. We find out we're dealing with peer pressure. We're dealing with all types of things that would actually cause us to want to give up on God. It wants us to give up on the right things to do. We find out that I want to have a job, but if I go out and sell drugs, I know I can get the money a little bit easy. But when you said that, we're looking at it in the world today where I want to write, but it sure pleases my flesh to have 3 or 4 different women on the side. Are y'all here with me today? And all of these things, when we're looking at our brethren around us and our sisters are around us, how we're killing each other, how we're even turning to prostitution, and it amazes me how many of us are even on drugs today. It causes us to want to give up. But I hear Brother Mark saying you can't give up because if you press forward, you got a cloud waiting on you.
Oh, yeah.
And if we learn how to get to Jesus by any means necessary, I hear God saying, I'm going to make your burdens even light. I hear in this book of Matthew here, and we find ourselves in the book of Matthew. And the book of Matthew consists of 2 different parts. The first part deals with the ministry of Jesus. It was unlike the other 2 books, the other 2 gospels, which started out with the birth of Jesus. Mark started out with the ministry of Jesus on to the death and resurrection of Jesus. And we find out here in the 5th verse, in this 5th chapter, it was during the ministry of Jesus. We find out here that Jesus, from the beginning of the book in chapter 1, starts out with Jesus actually being baptized of John the Baptist, and John seeing the Spirit descending upon him like a dove. And then he goes on a little further and talks about how Jesus went on a little further and he saw a man by the name of Simon and Andrew and John and James, and he called them to be disciples. And then it goes on a little further and Jesus illustrates the beginning of his miracles in the lessons taught today. Mark here in chapter 1, the 23rd verse and the 25th verse talks about how Jesus cast out the demon in the man in the synagogue. In that same chapter, in the 29th verse, Jesus healed Simon's mother-in-law of a fever. In that same chapter, around the 40th verse, he clears the man who second chapter, about the 18th verse, deals with Jesus answering the questions on fasting. And around that 23rd verse, it gives us the purpose of fasting.
Take your time, Rabbi.
And around that 3rd chapter, Jesus heals on the Sabbath day. And in that same chapter, around the 7th verse, many were healed at the seaside. And around that 13th verse in the same chapter, Jesus chooses the rest of his disciples. And in that 4th chapter, it says he deals with giving of parables. Jesus taught many things, and Jesus taught on parables or in parable fashion. And in that same verse, he dealt with the parable of the mustard seed. You know what I'm talking about this morning. And then around that 35th verse in chapter 4, Jesus quiets the sea. You remember the story about how Jesus and the disciples was on the sea, and the seas got rough, and the disciples got nervous and went down to the part of the ship where Jesus slept, and they said, Lord, the wind, and if you don't come up, we're going to be torn, we're going to be tossed, and we're going to be destroyed. Jesus said, how long have I to be with thee? And he went up and he quieted the winds and the waves, and I heard the disciples question within themselves, saying, what manner of man is this, that even the seas and the winds obey him? And now we find ourselves in the 5th chapter of Mark. It starts off by telling us how Jesus, after crossing over the sea, found himself in the city of Gadarene. And there was a man possessed with many demons in the graveyard. And the Bible here said that the demons recognized Jesus from the beginning, and they came upon Jesus and said, Master, what have I to do with thee? And Jesus after a while healed the man, and then the demons inside said, Lord, listen, that we got to depart from this man, then bid us to go into the swine. And Jesus gave his command that they can go into the swine, and even then the swine, they wouldn't deal with the demons, so they went and choked themselves in the sea.
Come on here, Rabbi.
And around that 21st verse, there came a man by the name of Jairus. Jairus was a ruler of the synagogue. If you don't know what a ruler of the synagogue is, a ruler is a person that handles the upkeep of the temple. Jairus was a ruler of the synagogue, but there was something wrong in Jairus' house. See, sometimes you got to come from where you are to get to where Jesus is.
Come on here, Rabbi.
Sometimes you can't get it at home, but you got to go to where Jesus is. The Bible here says that Jairus came to meet Jesus, and then he said, Lord, there's something wrong because my little daughter is sick and at the point of death. Well, as Jesus was on his way with the little girl, with Jairus, back to the little girl's house, there was something that happened in that journey to Jairus' house. Something happened along the way. There was a woman that had an issue of blood.
Come on